Good evening. We will call this work session to order for the Bountiful City Council, and we will first discuss our water outlook and conservation discussion, and we'll turn the time over to our engineer, Mr. Cheney.
Thank you, Mayor. Miranda, could you light up the show? Late last year, as we considered the last round of adjustments in our watering policy, I added a date to those that ran till, well, basically April 15th of this year. And I hoped at that time that last year's memories of water restrictions would just be a pleasant footnote, and that we would enjoy a nice summer with plenty of water. But unfortunately, it doesn't look that way. It looks like we may have a little bit of a repeat. I just wanted to give an introduction to our presentation and acknowledge that this is one of those famous group projects. You're going to hear from many of the department heads who are deeply involved with this issue across the city. And I hope that it'll be informative to you, that we'll answer some questions and be able to make some progress for what lies ahead. In the memo, I gave you some slides to look at, but I thought it would be helpful for a minute to review some other slides that give a little more historic perspective. And this is from the U.S. Drought Monitor, and it's basically 20 years of drought data. If you look over towards the right side of the screen, you can see the last couple of years. That's a pretty dramatic deficit that we've been in. And if we look a little closer at Utah over the last year or so, you can hone in on that. You can see that the D4 category, which was the exceptional drought category, kind of tapered off in December, thanks to some precipitation that we received. But it's still not that far away. Right now, 99% of the state is in a severe drought category. About 37% is in that dark red or extreme drought category. Just to help tell the story for kind of a more regional perspective, the Intermountain West, you can see, is suffering similar to what our state is. If you live in parts of Washington, northern Idaho, northwestern Montana, and Colorado, you're feeling pretty good about your water outlook. Even parts of New Mexico and Arizona are looking pretty good. But you can see that the rest of Oregon, the majority of Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada are kind of in a very tough position when it comes to snow water equivalent. The long-term prognosis is pretty tough. Over the last couple of weeks, we've had the opportunity to visit with some of our local providers. I'm sure that this isn't a great secret to anybody. They've been pretty good about getting the word out right now. But this is what we're hearing. For this upcoming year, our irrigation season is going to be reduced. It's going to start in mid-May and hopefully run till September. Now, I say hopefully because this is all allotment based. What I'm afraid is not being said is this: when it's gone, it's gone. And that is largely up to the population. It's up to the residents and how they use it. If it so happens that the residents of Bountiful use up Bountiful's allotment in July or August, Weber Basin is not going to send any more. That'll be the end of it. And that poses some fairly serious consequences for our residents and potentially for the city if people choose to start watering with culinary water. our culinary system is not set up to handle both the domestic demand and the irrigation demand. Unmetered services, which are essentially everything in Bountiful. I think the irrigation district has about 100 meters, give or take. Based on Weber Basin's restrictions, which is what Bountiful Irrigation intends to adopt, they're going to allow one watering per week per property with a 20-minute zone runtime for pop-up heads and a 40-minute runtime for rotary type heads. The one change that they did make in their preliminary restrictions was to change the wording for new landscaping. Originally, they had recommended that no new landscaping be installed. That was revised to say that new landscaping should comply with the current restrictions. In your packet, we listed some principles that we use to develop what we think our policies should be for this summer. And those focus on meeting our ability to meet the demand for our residents for their domestic use, for their household use, to maintain our emergency reserves, meaning our fire flows in our reservoirs. We thought it was very important to have a policy that was very uniform. In many cases, residents aren't easily able to distinguish the boundaries between service areas, who providers are, or what their different restrictions or policies would be. So we wanted to make it easy for people to understand and also equitable, so that everybody was kind of playing on the same level field. For our public spaces, those represent a serious investment of public funds. And we feel it's very important to maintain those because repairs are so costly. And we have these facilities for the benefit of the public. You know, we host many of our signature events, handcart days, the car show, Summerfest, you name it, in our really nice parks. And we need to have, we think it's important to have a place for the public to come and enjoy a facility that's nice. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be emerald green, but perhaps a place that maybe a little better than their own yards at times if their yards are suffering. Each jurisdiction, meaning the city or the irrigation providers, needs to be responsible to enforce their own restrictions. And I might just repeat for those who haven't seen the memo that Bountiful has several service districts that provide irrigation water. There's 3: Bountiful Irrigation, South Davis Water, and Haight Creek. So that's, or Dual Creek, sorry. Each one of those may have a little bit of a different take, and they need to be able to enforce their own restrictions. Given the implications of these policies, it's going to be very important for us to communicate to our residents why we're doing this and how they can help us. So those are kind of the main points that we focused on as we developed our policies. I'm going to skip this. Do you have any questions? We'll get back to this. I'm going to turn the time over to Craig Christensen.
All right. Good evening, Mayor Harris and Council. Thanks for letting me come here this evening to talk about the water supply that we have here in Bountiful. If you look at the first bullet point, kind of the breakdown here is just what percentage, what we're going to do for each of our sources. The treatment plant it provides about 20% of the water that we produce in Bountiful. During the times of year like right now, we're able to produce the most amount of water that we're able to get throughout the year. We have the ability now to treat about 1,400 gallons a minute. That equals out to about 2 million gallons a day. But that is short-lived throughout the year, and it can drop down to flows of 150 gallons to 500 gallons in the fall and winter months. So like I said, that provides about 20% of our water for the year. The next bullet point is the wells that we have. And wells are the biggest producer for us. We utilize those a lot, and we rely on each of those wells a lot. We have 9 of them in the city, 5 of them that we use more often than not. They're pretty much down here in the valley floor. And we have a couple that are up by the treatment plant that we're able to help substitute some of the water there. But we rely really heavily on these to produce the water that is needed for the residents of Bountiful. The other 20% is water that we get a purchase from Weber Basin. And we have a contract with them. We've had it since the 50s that we're able to get 1,000 acre feet a year from them. And this year they have actually reduced that as part of their reduction for the drought, is that the culinary use would be cut by 10%, which only allows us to have our 900 acre feet versus the normal 1,000. We have the ability to use that from 2 different metered sites in town. One of them's up at the Holbrook booster station and reservoir, and the other one is down here by Mill Creek booster station and reservoir.
Can I just ask a quick question? So you said that they're cutting it by 10%.
Yes.
Do you know what our consumption has been in the past?
We pretty much use that 1,000 gallons a year.
Okay,
Yeah, 1,000 acre feet, sorry.
okay,
Because we purchase it, we pay for that allotted amount, so we use that.
okay.
We try to get it down to the gallon. So
Thank you.
it's either use it or lose it, so. But part of the allotment that we're gonna use this year is gonna be for the Holbrook site, just so we can keep that water up there in the Holbrook Reservoir up there. We also have the ability to use a metered connection to the South Davis Water District as well, and that is at our 3100 South Booster Station on the south side of town. And we use that to offset some of the demand that is needed in those peak times of years when we don't have the treatment plant and well production starts to drop off a little. So between all those sources, like I said, the wells are pretty much what we rely on pretty heavily. And we do have a pretty good amount of storage between the 15 reservoirs that we have sprinkled throughout the city. We're able to have the storage capacity to have the 19,450,000 gallons of storage. But just to give you an insight, the peak day demand last year was just under 5.6 million gallons consumed in a day. So it's just kind of gives you an insight to that. But at this time, I'd just like to answer any questions from council if you have any, or.
What'd you say our daily use was? Like
The peak day last year was just shy of 5.6 million.
What about our average day?
Average days are about 4,
Okay.
yeah.
And maybe to follow up on that, what's the variation of from maybe a winter month compared to a typical summer month? Thus kind of helping us understand how much is to secondary or outdoor watering versus indoor watering? You follow?
So obviously, summer months are a lot heavier. July, August, September are the heavy use months for big demand on the system. During the winter months, 2 million is pretty reasonable for what would be consumed. But 4 is about the average if you average out the whole year. But November, December, January, February are pretty low producing months.
I have a question about the wells.
Yes.
Sorry, the wells are producing about 60% of the
Yes.
water. And you put that 5 are used daily. If all of them are being utilized, does that bump up that amount? I mean, well,
It can, because of the locations of some of these wells, if we're running like 4 of them in this zone down here, it would fill up the reservoir too fast and we'd have to just shut them off anyways. Kind of the way that the system is designed, it's kind of a redundancy. So we have these other ones that can be utilized for a reserve type if there is a situation where something goes wrong, a motor goes out, something like that.
using some and at any given time.
Yes.
And could you explain for people who are listening at home and for some of us who may not understand the physics behind water, the problem of running wells too fast and how the effects of that and why that can be negative,
Okay, so
the flow?
yeah, so if we have so many different horsepower motors that you can fluctuate anything from 100 gallons a minute to 1,200 gallons a minute. And so a lot of these, like we just got the first east well back up and running again. That was generally run about 800 gallons a minute just before it went out. When it was first installed, it was 1,000 gallons a minute. And so drawdowns of aquifers, overuse from continually pumping, it draws down the water in the aquifer down, and it can get to the point where you can introduce air into the system, and it can cause problems with the impellers. And so we want to try to keep those things submerged all the time in water. That's why we try to run them to the point where we need that demand satisfied, but yet stop them to allow the aquifers to try to regenerate. And so that's what we try to do with our system, and that's why, like right now, we're using treatment plant water, and it's producing so much that we're filling up reservoirs, and we're actually dropping down to different reservoirs further down in the system. So wells are not running as much right now because we have the treatment plant water, which is more efficient to produce that water than it is to pump water up to a reservoir. So it's all just gravity feed dropping down. So I hope that answered a little bit for you.
Mayor, if I could add a couple of comments.
Please.
First, I'd like to clarify that staff doesn't have any concerns about our ability to supply culinary water. Bountiful is very lucky to have so many sources. We do have a limited ability to meet some of our demands, though, in the late summer when demand is really high. I would offer as an example our 3100 South booster station. It's one of the largest booster stations we have, and we have 3 pumps in there that any one of them, if it were ran individually, would pump 800 gallons a minute. But when you start adding them, running them in series, you don't get 1,600 gallons a minute if you run 2. You might get 1,200 gallons a minute. And then if you added in the third one, you might get 1,600 or 1,700 gallons a minute. There's just so many losses in the system when you try and pump that kind of water. With respect to some of our other sources, though, we do have some that are fairly limited. The 2 wells that are up by the treatment plant can only be run for just a limited amount of time, and we try and save those for later times in the summer when the flows are down in the creek, but yet we still need to process water through the treatment plant to keep those filters productive and in good condition. We can't really just shut that facility off and let it sit idle. It needs to have a minimum amount of flow through it, and And that's one of the ways that we mitigate that need is through those 2 wells up there. But we do have plenty of water. We're in good shape that way. But when it comes to the hot months in the summer, it's all we can do to keep water in some of our reservoirs and to meet the demand, the irrigation demand in the south part of town.
Thank you. Any other questions
I
for
have
Craig?
one if I could. I keep hearing, Craig, that the one bright spot in the water year this year is that soil moisture is up from last year significantly.
Yes, it is.
Do we see that in our aquifers already? Or
Yes.
do you track the levels of those?
Yeah, we track the levels. It's been something that Jerry and myself have been doing a lot more for over the last year. There was previous records, but it is something we're tracking, and they are replenishing and getting back up to what they were historically. So,
Do you know if we're ahead of where we were last year?
yes, I believe so.
Perfect. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Over to Lloyd.
Randy, could you switch back to me? That's a nice bear hunting blind, isn't it? Technical difficulties.
While you're doing that, can I ask a question to Craig again? Mayor, is that okay? Craig, can you explain if we see any water quality differences throughout the year, particularly from our wells, middle of the summer versus in the winter, for example, as we draw and use that as, do we see any issues there?
Historically, no, we haven't had many problems as far as drawdowns on wells too far, creating too many issues as far as like bacteria samples or anything like that. It is something that we do test for weekly, and those get sent out to Davis County, and they give us the results back. Everything is always spot on. There are a few hiccups every now and then, kind of like what happened last year with the radium, but that was a small hiccup, and we got that fixed and got that back on track. And with that source not being used, that aquifer level has got back up to where it should be, so.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, with that, of course, one of the reasons for this discussion tonight is to talk about our proposed restrictions for the upcoming summer. Many of these you'll recognize from last year, for those who were on the council last year. To lead off, our first restriction would be to limit the use of culinary water in areas of the city that are already served by an irrigation provider. This is actually one thing that was recommended by Weber Basin in the presentation that we saw earlier last week. And as I understand, as the irrigation system was initially put in the city, it was also considered as a requirement, but it was later removed. We think that this is particularly important because our system is not designed to handle the irrigation load, and this would help to keep the field level for those who have irrigation in one part of town but don't in the other. The second point is the restriction on hours for watering outdoors. This is not new. It's actually in the city code, and is one of probably the main focus of enforcement that was used by Bountiful Irrigation and South Davis Water. Our city staff also used that as one of the criteria for enforcement last year. Last year's restrictions also included a recovery day. And we found that to be very helpful. It allowed, by not allowing watering on Wednesday, and this would be the same this year as it was last summer, that gave our reservoirs a chance to catch up and to make sure that we actually had emergency storage on hand. As far as watering, we're recommending the same provisions as Bountiful Irrigation and Weber Basin, that watering be permitted for 1 day a week with a 20-minute zone runtime for pop-up heads, a 40-minute zone runtime for rotor heads. But we did feel like we needed to define what hand watering is. There is some talk among the providers about that being a little bit uncertain, and we wanted people to have an expectation for how we see hand watering to be used, that it's very limited in nature. 5 gallons a minute is about the average flow out of a hose, and that we actually wanted someone to be there when the hose was being used and not throw a little sprinkler head on it and run back inside for half hour or whatever till you remember to go turn it off. We felt it was also appropriate to address pools. We do have several pools under construction at any one time in the city. A pool that's in operation really doesn't require a significant amount of water to operate. I mean, they do require some, but it's the filling of a new pool that can be very impactful for our system. For example, if you have a pool that's 50,000 gallons, that's 100 minutes of runtime for a pump that pumps 500 gallons a minute. Now, if that occurs in the middle of the day, when power is expensive, that becomes a hit on the utility bill. But it also may come at a time when we don't have a lot of storage in our reservoir. So we wanted to come up with a way to manage how pools could still be filled, but have less impact on the system. So we felt that it would be appropriate that that be done with a hose that's connected to the primary structure. It's not an uncommon practice. Here in Bountiful, a common practice is for people to go get a meter from the water department and hook up a 2-inch hose to a fire hydrant and let her rip. So in just a matter of a couple of hours, you could fill your pool and have a pretty big hit on our system. We thought it would be definitely less impactful on the water system to fill those at a much more metered pace. As far as our parks and public facilities, again, I'm just going to repeat that we feel very strongly about the need to maintain those and to protect the public investment. These are spaces that are intended to be enjoyed by the public, and we want to be able to provide places for people to go that are enjoyable, that they can still go to a place that's well cared for. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be emerald green, but it will be an appropriate public space, and Brock is going to talk about their plans to maintain those facilities. For the golf course, we need to be able to maintain our playing conditions. Now, again, that doesn't mean that it's going to look like Augusta every day, but we need to have people come and enjoy our golf course so that it can help to support its operations. And our staff at the golf course is very conscientious about how they maintain that facility, and our intent is to prevent the permanent damage and preserve that investment. Do you have any questions about these recommendations?
At this point, we have this and 5 or 6 items that Brock's going to talk to you about that we're kind of want to get direction from you as we go. We need some guidance on some things. And so one item we're looking for here is that on the agenda tonight is a resolution that adopts these restrictions. So if there if there are concerns about these, we can talk about them at the end, or we'd love to hear any thoughts now that you have about this.
I'm comfortable with the restrictions that we're proposing in the resolution. I do have some concerns about communications. We've traditionally put a lot of emphasis on social media. We do have our e-newsletter that goes out twice a month, our physical newsletter that I know we're going to be talking about changing its frequency later today. But I'm worried we're still not penetrating far enough, in particular in the areas where residents are served by a water district. They should have received a postcard, but I think that one postcard will get lost and tossed after sitting on the kitchen counter for a few weeks. And so I'm curious if the staff has had any conversations with our water district friends about continued unified communications, and also communications about where if a resident feels like they're seeing an abuse, to send those. I mean, that was definitely something that occurred last year, where I think each of us were receiving complaints for about violations in water district areas, which leaves us with a referral back to the water districts who have much smaller staff. So communication is still where I am just a little bit worried.
I think I could address a couple of those issues. As we met with Bountiful Irrigation, and as I talked to Jake at South Davis Water, we all agreed that it was very important that we share messages across our platforms, and be able to provide that same message. I don't have any hesitation about calling down there to Kirk at Bountiful Irrigation and being able to explain what we're doing, or have him call and explain what they need to do, and that we'd be able to post that on our website. Boy, I forgot the second part of your enforcement.
Between agencies.
Yeah,
Complaints.
okay, thanks. Complaints. So Weber Basin, at their suggestion, has created on their own webpage. Now, I realize that we don't really have any Weber Basin customers here that we're talking about, but it became the model for Bountiful Irrigation on their webpage, that they have a complaint page. And their policy is going to be that anybody who wants to file a complaint would need to provide their own contact information, the address of the violation, kind of the nature of the violation, and a photograph, so that they have some kind of documentation. That's going to be probably their primary source for enforcement. I don't know that they're going to go out and do a whole lot of patrolling. That may change, but they have implemented that on their website. I was on their website today and saw that it's up and running and ready to go. And I suppose it could be possible for us to develop the same kind of thing on the city's webpage. So I would say if you get questions from residents and you're able to identify, who's your provider, you could direct them to Bountiful Irrigation's page to actually formalize a complaint.
To go along with that question, a lot of us probably received the Bountiful Irrigation postcard. Will we be, as a city, be sending out something like that to all of the users who, above Bountiful Boulevard, who use Culinary for their irrigation, and we are the provider? How will we be communicating with all of those households?
Last year, as we adopted regulations, we actually delivered a door hanger to every door. And that was a pretty strenuous effort. But we were able to do it with staff. I think we could do that again if that's the council's desire. I think we could also put together a mailer that could go out. We could include it in perhaps an upcoming utility bill that goes out. I think we have several options for for doing that.
It's one of the reasons we want to be consistent and with our rules with the other districts, so that if somebody on Bountiful Culinary for irrigation has the same restrictions as somebody who's using secondary water from, Bountiful Sub, or then no matter if they get ours or theirs, they're going to be aware of the same restrictions. So we actually have a section in the staff report, maybe we can look at that now on page 11, about some of the communication ideas, and then we can come back to some of the park things while we're on this topic. But some of the ideas that we kicked around as far as what we want to message and how include encouraging people to understand that we're all in this together, and that personal conservation really is for the benefit of everyone. We want to make sure that we are providing regular messaging through social media, our website, the Davis Journal, who is here tonight, and I'm sure taking copious notes. We have good media partners in that regard too. We will be able to take advantage of our utility billing system and mailers as well, and anything else that the council would like us to. There have been efforts through the recorders, had this conversation, Shauna and her organization, about having unified messaging between cities. The city managers have talked about that. And so we hope between all of us, we're going to find some unified messaging along these ways. We want to provide some visible examples on our website of what WaterWise landscaping looks like. There's a great webpage called Localscapes that we've been directed to, that provides examples of what you can do in your park strips or other areas if you're looking for WaterWise types of installations. Weber Basin Water District has some great information as well that way. We're also considering converting some of our city areas as examples of WaterWise landscaping, so people can, come take a look and see a physical example in the city. We want to clearly post our water restriction information on the city website, and then we're also considering some on-site signs, particularly for those high-use areas we're going to talk about, that explaining, maybe why Fourth North Park is a little greener than City Hall or your own residential neighborhood. Help people understand that we're trying to maximize the good to the public and not create damage that we're just going to have higher fees or taxes to replace later. So those are some of the ideas that we have, and noted down some of the other ones that you've talked about so far. We're definitely open to other suggestions that you have.
May I make one suggestion? Could, in our mailer, when we are in the utility bill, could we include this map so people know or can be aware what district they're in?
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be helpful. Just to-
Probably, and contact information. I don't think that
Yes.
map has it, but yeah, that's a great idea.
Thank you.
I have a few ideas. In efforts to save water, I think communication's huge. And if we can engage our citizens in a way that help us get that message out, I think would be great. Maybe it's by having them highlight people that are doing a great job on social media, and maybe tagging us with a hashtag or something. If we can make it positive and entertaining, I think we'll get more message out there for those that are on social media. That is a free resource. Another idea is if we could, as a water department, maybe identify high water users that we have a history of, and send them a letter and say, hey, we've identified you as a high water user, and you're using X amount of the water that's based on the percentage of an average citizen, and help them be aware of that. I think that hopefully could maybe increase some dialogue with them or something, but maybe some are using 500% of the average homeowner's water and they're not aware. Maybe they are, I don't know. But engaging those that are maybe an exceptional power user. Another idea is, I was thinking of the golf course, maybe for Brock. You know, I know golf courses have a lot of flexibility with watering with their heads and having a valve in the head. Maybe we can identify areas where we can just turn those heads off. Maybe that's at city parks as well, or other city properties where we can have greater control of prioritizing where water goes, possibly. I have more, but maybe that suffices for now.
I don't want to
could-
stop you if you've got more. I've got a couple. We can see if I hit any of yours and then
Great.
come back. Last year, one of the things that I experienced towards the end of the season is people's lawns were brown and some people were frustrated. They felt like they were really trying, but then a city park in particular might look extra green. I would often point them to where we had outlined different city properties and their priority, and then the maintenance level that we were trying to achieve and the different tools that the Parks Department was employing. But the only way I was able to reference that was to continually point back to the packet for that particular work session and say, go to this link, and then go to page 10, and then you'll find where we've done this analysis. It's not every park that is being given special attention. There are some properties we're letting go, or we're actually deploying different wetting agents and enzymes and things like that in this particular area, but we're not over here. And so I would love to see Brock and the Parks Department's outline that does start on page 9 of the packet and flows over to pages 10 and 11, live on the city website prominently. If not prominently, at least somewhere in the Parks Department where it can be referred to, so that the public is aware of the thoughtful analysis that the Parks Department and the staff has done, and that the council has considered in, why properties are given a higher priority and some are given a lower priority, and where we're incurring different costs of their tax dollars in order to try and do extra aerating, extra fertilizing, extra wetting agent, those types of things, so that they do look good with less water, and so that those are easy for them to find. I think that if it can be easier to experience your own self-sacrifice if you feel like there was thoughtful analysis and are aware of where to even find that analysis, as your own, yard looks browner and your flower beds die off. Did I hit any of yours, Jesse, or do you want to go back?
I think communication is key, and when we can see that the city's doing our part, I think it's very helpful. And last year I had many comments say, well, why is this property this way and that way? And as much as we can educate and inform, I think is helpful. I think it's really important that if we could, I don't know, how are we working with other property owners, such as the school district or churches or other places where there's a lot of maybe property managers of sorts that we could engage and help us in this effort? Is that happening to some degree or anticipated, or how do you anticipate that working?
Yeah, we usually have a pretty open dialogue with the school district. They last year tried, I think they followed the recommendations of Weber Basin Water. Near the end of the season, they contacted us for the ability to put a little extra water at the end of the season on some of their playing fields. We had drafted our restrictions in such a way that to do that would have required more council action. And fortunately, before we had to come back and have you amend any kind of a policy, it rained a lot. And so they didn't have to do that for the end of their sports field seasons. But what we've written in the resolution that you're going to consider tonight is that public high-use properties, sort of as determined, would have the ability to provide more of that site-specific use on high-use properties so that we don't see the damage that can be costly to repair. So in other words, that brings in a public property like a school district if they need a little bit of extra help. We found last year that some of the other big users around the city were very compliant with the restrictions. We didn't have to reach out and remind the churches or anybody. They were really good. But it's a good idea at this point in time for us to be thinking about maybe some of the high power users that we can coordinate with early, that they can help support the message. So.
Great, thanks. Any other questions before we move on?
I'd like to just offer two really quick suggestions, along with our, the conversion of some of our city properties, possibly for water-wise landscaping. I would love to see the city engage with some of our residents who might be experts in this field or who have done it, who are using localscapes or water-wise landscaping, and I think would be really helpful to bring people to, for some kind of classes. We could do that as a city service and engage with some of the experts, and that we have horticulture experts here in the city. I also was just thinking that people are getting ready to make purchases. Even though it's snowing outside right now, or did today, people are getting ready to make their summertime vegetation purchases, flowers, plants, vegetables. And I think the sooner we get this messaging out, the better, because so many of these annual type of flowers, et cetera, that people are typically purchasing just in a month from now, around Mother's Day, they are thirsty. They are thirsty, water, they drink a lot of water, and they're not going to survive this hand watering once a week, 20 minutes. So I would love to see us getting this messaging out sooner than later before people go and make investments in vegetation that they're not going to be able to keep alive and support. So I hope.
Okay.
And there are, I know Basil and Rose, the local shop, they offer classes, as well as Weber Basin offers classes, if people are interested right now in knowing where they can go to get information. But yeah, that's great. Those are great ideas. Thank you.
So if there aren't any more questions on communications right now, I think we'd like to turn time over to Brock to talk about, I think, 4 or 5 items that we need some direction on and what the expected level of service will be for parks and public properties.
Thank you, Mayor and members of the City Council. Appreciate your time tonight. And you could just come down here and read this for me. It's the same thing you just said. So I appreciate Council Member Bell and Bradshaw already considering these kinds of things. I think the important thing for you to learn tonight about the priorities of our properties is we manage about 47 properties across town. We've taken those properties and prioritized them into uses. Even our priority 1 properties such as Fourth North and Town Square and this campus, for instance, some of our other public buildings, we've even broken them into a category where it's a high-use category and just a simple high visual category. Now, our high-use categories, of course, are going to be Town Square and Fourth North. Our soccer fields, our ball fields, those things that get used, heavily used throughout this summer season. We've even taken each of those properties, as we have with all 47, and looked and tried to identify each of those properties as to what is critical turf and what is not, what should be watered, what shouldn't be watered. And so even at Fourth North, we might be just maintaining the turf inside where the cars and the majority of the activity takes, and let the perimeters go a little bit. So we are cognizant of that. We are aware that our high-use sports fields, they get used in the summertime, but not necessarily in early spring or late fall, and so they'll fall out of that high-use category, and we would adjust accordingly. So I want you to understand that as we look at our properties and prioritize those. We're even analyzing each of the properties themselves and making decisions about how we're gonna water those. So we're very, we're gonna be very cognizant of the way we water our properties. So just understand that. I think that's probably the most important thing you need to understand. In your packet, as an attachment, there is a property priority list, so that if you have questions about what each property is, you can understand that. And even if you have questions as to why we categorize them that way, I'd be happy to answer those as your questions arise.
Brock, I did have one question if I could.
Yeah.
In the list of priorities, under priority 1, I don't see a category where you're prioritizing property for use by city employees.
Meaning,
Meaning, it's good to remind folks that the priorities you have are not because you want to go play at the park. It's
Yeah.
so that all of the residents can go use our facilities.
yes,
So that's
absolutely.
one of the complaints that I fielded a few times last summer and tried to explain, and it didn't sound very sympathetic, was these parks aren't being maintained so that city employees have someplace green to go eat lunch.
Right.
It's because they're being used heavily by residents, and they need the health of the turf needs maintenance. So, anyway, just a reminder that this is not for Brock Hill's benefit, that you're maintaining these fields and these parks.
I appreciate
Sorry to
that.
get about that at a roundabout way.
No, I appreciate that, because I've had that same question asked to me, and it is difficult to defend at times.
Yeah?
And, you know, they only see their view. I understand that, I appreciate that, and that's valuable. But, you know, we try to maintain these properties for the benefit of all of Bountiful City, and I don't know how else to help people understand that, but say it. So, thank you.
Well, and if I may add to that, and I think it's beneficial for everyone to understand this piece of it too, a private property owner can limit who is on their property. You know, I can tell my boys they can't have their friends over in the backyard, you know, they're gonna have to play in the garage or something. But with public property, we don't have that luxury. We can't just tell people not to show up at town square unless we fenced and closed properties. And so we have less ability to regulate use than you know, the private property owner does too.
Thanks.
Brock, I have a question on one of the Tier 1 priorities, Town Square. This came up consistently last year, and I've already seen some of our residents talking about it on various social media platforms. The water feature. The water feature is recirculated water. It is one of those free places, cheap places for families, young families to go and cool off in the summer, especially since we're going to encourage them not to do things we might have done growing up, like run through the sprinklers. So I think it's an important asset, but how can we assure the public that it is a thoughtful review of the recirculation of that water and what that water loss, if there is any, over the course of a day or a week looks like, because that is a very visible water feature that is already kind of drawing some speculation.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. I've talked to a couple of our staff about that some, and without historical information from the water department, it's a guess for me. I suspect we're probably losing about between 200 and 300 gallons of water per day, whether it's through evaporation or migration. Kids fill their buckets and haul it out and water whatever, share it with the neighbor, put it on the grass, water a tree, whatever it is. So I've been planning to enlist the help of the water department to help me track that, because it is culinary water. They'd help us understand what's running through our meter, how much we're losing, how much we're keeping. So that's part of our anticipated use this year. Also part of our management plan is maybe limiting the run time. You know, in previous years, we've just let it run so that it could be a use for residents when they want to, as opposed to maybe restricting times this year. Those are things that we've yet to really talk about and determine and present to you as a recommendation. So that will be forthcoming as we get closer to that season.
And could I suggest in our communication strategies that if we were thinking about some of those yard signs that explain different uses or areas that are drier, browner, greener, a sign that does mention that it's recirculated water at the park would probably be helpful, and then as we dive into some of those other questions.
Just don't put it next to the no dogs allowed sign, because nobody sees those.
Nobody pays attention.
Exactly.
Any other questions about priority use or things along those lines? I do have a big question about flowers this year. Our anticipation is that we'll just put some flowers in the areas that are high visibility. So of course, Main Street is obviously high visibility. It's something that we want to support. It's one of your priorities. And we anticipate planting flowers on Main Street. Probably some supplemental planting with perennials this year, just to help cut down on the water use. That's our plan. Also at Fourth North, I think you can read there the listed properties that we anticipate putting those in. Unless we receive direction from you otherwise, that's our plan moving forward. Yeah.
Have we already purchased those flowers, or is there any way we could target some flowers that are more hardy, more drought resistant, and even just ornamental plantings that cabbages, or I don't even know what they are, but things that are more, that are still colorful but more drought resistant in those spaces?
Yeah, we've already been planning for that. We already have about, I think we're about 5,000 to 6,000 plants in the greenhouse right now. We have an additional about 10,000 plants being propagated by other, like Crossy or Rockany down here, also up in Syracuse. We have a supplier. And all of those we've chosen for water conservancy on those. So we've looked at that already. And that's part of our plan to supplement that with the perennials.
I, for one, would welcome maybe a deviation from previous years when we've had more water, and they've looked great. I think that's been an appropriate priority in places where we've had beautiful flowers. But I'm okay deviating from that to some degree this year. If you can locate any silk flowers or plastic flowers, no. But I think having an obvious water conservation mode, I think, is important.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult for us this year. I appreciate those remarks, and we're planning on going that route. So the flowers won't necessarily be as prolific. I think if you've driven around town a little bit, you've seen the bulbs that are already up. Those were planted last fall in anticipation for this, to kind of get some fill-in color before we get to our planting season. So we do have plans in place, and we anticipate following those.
I'm comfortable with the reduction in flowers, completely comfortable, and in the direction of finding water-wise flowers. In areas where we've traditionally planted that we aren't planting, what is our plan to make sure that those still stay weed-free? It is amazing how weeds can continue to grow without any water. And so I want to make sure that even though they're vacant of flowers, they're still looking maintained.
Yeah, we'll either fill those, so there's a couple levels there, right? Some of the areas we'll do more perennial planting, more shrub planting, and then ground covers, whether it's mulch or a low water use ground cover. That's our anticipated plan there. And then the other areas will just receive mulch, bark mulch, weed barrier bark mulch.
And then I think those areas that are getting the weed barrier bark mulch and not getting flowers, those are also a perfect location for us to utilize some yard signs that says, you know, this area has consciously been left without flowers because of the drought.
That's a good idea.
They can be like flowers, these yard signs that pop up with messages.
Maybe we could employ our local artists and have them paint, you know, have them in the shape of a tulip and paint it.
Okay, what other questions do you have for us, Brock, or what other items?
Lloyd already hinted at the golf course. You know, the golf courses and the cemeteries, they take a pretty big hit. They're an easy target for, you know, folks who don't understand what we're trying to do and may not get the messaging. But Tom is very proactive in this. He's already got a plan in place. He followed it to a degree last year, knowing that, you know, we were on restrictions last year, and even this year's gonna be a little tighter. He and I and Kent are meeting as staff, and we'll identify areas on the course that we can just absolutely let go, the perimeters, some of those areas. We're gonna get some kickback from residents, but I think in the messaging is gonna be important there. We're gonna focus on tees, greens, and fairways to keep them playable. They will be cut to a longer length so that, you know, they're not gonna require as much water. We're gonna let the roughs go a little rougher and probably a little less green. So he's identified those areas in the roughs that we can do. We need to sit down as a staff and really identify the areas of the course that can be let go. We can throttle off the irrigation so that no water reaches those areas and conserve that way. The cemetery, of course, is gonna be huge for us this year. It's typically been known to be well-maintained, and Gino is prepared to help with this, and we're gonna just water within the restrictions. So it's gonna look yellow. It's gonna look like dormant turf. We'll post signs and educate people on what we're doing there to help them understand what we're doing and being good neighbors and trying to conserve water just like everybody else. So we wanna make sure that people understand that, you know, it's gonna be yellow. We're not gonna let it die. We're not gonna lose turf, but it will be yellow. So those are probably the biggest things. And then the big elephant in the room, of course, is Washington Park. Lots of questions there that we need your direction on. Given where we are with the restrictions we have, you know, do we go ahead with 6+ acres of new turf? Do we go ahead with the new plantings? And how do we help them survive? How do we get through this in that, knowing that we've made some commitments to the school district, knowing that we're gonna be an example to the public with a new park? And what does that mean? We need your direction on that, what your expectations are with that. If there's some compromises in there somewhere that we can meet, maybe it's just the fields, maybe it's something else. We recommend going forward with that on a limited basis and helping us understand what that means from your viewpoint. Those are the questions that are outstanding for us as staff and would like your direction on.
So when we look at the interlocal agreement that we entered into with the school district, we told them we would have playable fields for them as of this fall. Is that right?
Springtime next year.
Okay, a year from now,
Yeah.
we would have playable fields.
And knowing that, you know, by the time we get to that, even in the construction timing, as we get moving on this project, which could be July, by the time we get to planting seed, we may be past water, available water anyway. And what does that mean? Are we gonna have to tap our culinary system to be able to provide that commitment? And it's not just, in my view, it's not just a commitment to the school district, right? It's a commitment to our citizens. We've committed to them to provide this new park. We've put that out there. We've had meetings. We've talked to them. We've had their input. We understand what it is that they want. And so maybe that's changed now. We don't know. But I think it would be smart of us to reach out and see what their temperature is for this going forward. But as staff, we intend to, unless otherwise directed.
What questions do you have, council?
Brock, I've got a question. How soon do we need to make this decision? I mean, for like moving forward, when do you think this decision needs to be made?
We're at 50% design right now. Lloyd and I are reviewing plans right now and have committed to get those red lines and recommendations back to the landscape architect within the next day or so. I would think certainly by the end of 100% construction documents, we need to make a decision, which is 2 to 3 weeks away.
How long do they anticipate construction taking?
Is it a 5-month build? Yeah, 5 to 6 months.
And starting in July?
By the time we get through the bidding process and the selection process and, yeah.
Landscape's usually the last thing to be installed.
And it could be beyond that 15th of September if we make it to that day, right?
One of the things we have going for us on the project is a lot of the irrigation is already in place. That's a substantial amount of work that really doesn't, it needs to be adjusted, but it doesn't have to be, it's not like new work that has to go in. So I think the landscaping could start, well before the end of that 5-month time frame, and that's assuming that all the other pieces fall into place, so we don't run into some hiccups with supply chain or other things.
What is, oh, sorry,
Go ahead.
what is the latest we could plant grass if we were to go, or turf this route? For it to take root, be healthy and ready for next spring?
Anything after the 15th of October is just a 50-50 chance. So it's got to be on the ground before then,
What about seed versus sod?
seed.
Seed has to be in by September.
Yeah, and the thing is you've got to get that root established, at least in the dirt, for it to survive the winter, right?
And is there any benefit to putting down sod that then can have snow sit on top of it? Putting that down late?
Sod's going to survive a little better, and it'll establish more quickly in the spring when it comes around. But you're up against cost there. I don't know how we do that.
It's anticipated that everything would be seed.
Yeah, right? As of right now, yeah.
The latest I heard today is that sod is becoming a precious commodity.
Is it subject
Weeks-
to, are we
weeks
shipping
of
it in
lead
from
time.
China?
And
My-
just,
Go ahead.
just to confirm, planting the seed, that would be watering every single day?
Yeah, the critical thing,
Twice a
well,
day?
depends on temperatures too, and evapotranspiration, which is what, technically, it's the soil losing its water due to temperatures. And so temperatures, nighttime temperatures in particular, are gonna be critical there. If we can be below that, we can go a little later. It's just gonna be dependent upon weather, and so they kind of set a hard date as October 15th, right? Because then things don't give it enough heat, don't give it enough warm, you're losing your soil temperatures to propagate the seed. So before that is ideal.
I think you ask about Washington and if we make any changes, my feel is if it's turf areas that are active play and usable for recreation, then we proceed with turf in those areas and everything else, which is largely the plan, I think. Everything else is not turf. And I think we watch the weather and watch construction scheduling and determining when the plants are planted is my personal feel.
Yeah, I think another thing that's critical to understand too is that next year's water probably is gonna not be any better, right? The forecasting in water and precipitation probably isn't gonna get better. So if we delay it this year, when? This year might be the right time, just given we know what we are gonna get. Next year, we don't. So if we delay it, we could be facing that dilemma.
Would there be reason to consider some areas in seed and some areas of sod to try and meet this balance where trying to get some field space established for the cycle we've agreed to with the school district, but other areas that could be sod where we try and take advantage of some winter water sitting, winter snow water sitting on top of it to help?
Yeah, we could look at that, analyze that in the budget, see how it fits, see what impact that's gonna do or make, yeah.
I think that's a good
Quick
idea.
question about the interlocal agreement. So on the master plan, we've got 2 lacrosse fields, full lacrosse fields, then like practice field. Are all 3 fields part of the interlocal agreement, or is the third field that is smaller, and I believe it's kind of regulation size for Pee Wee football, is that right? That is not part of the interlocal agreement, and that's really a question.
Yeah, I think we've committed to just 2 fields, and they're the larger fields that they're saying lacrosse. I think they should be noted, by us, is that they're multi-use fields. That's how I see it as a parks department, and that's how we're gonna manage it. But I think it's also worthy of a conversation with the school district and just have a discussion with them about this and see if they're willing to delay. I think that's a conversation that could be had. I think they're fully aware of what they're up against. I would assume they would think the same of us, and so a conversation with the school district for sure should take place to see what that means to them.
In that conversation with the school district, since they are, so invested in the field space for a particular sport, they have committed resources to put in those 2 fields. Would they be willing to increase their commitment to those fields if we were to do them in sod, if it helped with water? So it didn't blow a giant hole in our overall budget for the park. If it's critical to the school district that those be ready for the springtime lacrosse season, it seems to me maybe they're willing to help bridge a gap between seed and sod, if that helps us save on water.
Yeah, I think it's a worthy part of that discussion that needs to happen.
If I could add to this, I think it's appropriate to tell you that I tried to contact the school district last week, but because of spring break, that was a little difficult. I was able to get in touch with Dan Linford today, and Dan is the contact that we've been working with at the district. And I explained to him the situation we're in with the park and the prospects of water and having a set of fields ready for them to use in the spring. Dan and also Tony or Troy Best, anyway, he's their athletic rep. I talked to him too. They both agreed that the school district could be flexible with the park. If we're able to provide fields for them to use in the spring, they would be thrilled. But they understand they're in the same predicament, They're concerned about the viability of their own fields, and they're willing to work with us if those fields are not available for play. They'll make adjustments in their schedules and where they can go to play and practice.
So within the timeline where you need the council to give direction on grass for Washington Elementary, do we think we could have that further conversation about whether the school district would rather wait based on the water situation or help fund a turf choice that will take root faster and use less water, but is going to cost more? And then I'd, love the analysis of does that buy us how much true water savings?
Right.
Because I'm thinking only of when I've installed my own lawn and when we tried to take advantage of the winter weather season to help that sod take root.
What's your feeling on that? Is that something that we can talk to them about and then come back and make a final decision on that?
Yeah, I think that's
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Do you feel like you have the direction you need for us to move on to Francisco's piece?
Mayor, could I ask one additional question? Is there, when we come back to this and discuss it after you've had the opportunity to talk to the district, is there any way you could give us an analysis as to cost of seed versus cost and availability of turf? What that would what that comparison would actually be.
Yes, it would. Yep. So part of the further discussion we need to have with the school district also is how much funding do they have available that they were going to put into play for landscaping, you know, sod, seed, whichever that was, that would come back to our budget. So all of those things are in play.
I did have a further question, not as much related to Washington Elementary, but about the pricing on different irrigation system upgrades in the staff report, where you've priced out different controllers and valve sensors and rain sensing systems and different smart watering systems. Obviously, to do all of the different controllers and master valves, flow sensors, and all of these things all at once would be a significant budget impact since we're in budget review season. I did feel like I was left at the end of that section of the staff report on what is the recommendation to bite off a smaller chunk and do some now, do Washington Elementary for sure because it's a new park and we should use this newest technology there for sure, and then upgrade others on a schedule or take advantage of rebates and do it fast. So anyway, I wasn't left with what our firm conclusion was on the pricing for these different options to be more thoughtful about our sprinkling systems in the future.
So
Sure.
the recommendation from staff is that we would take advantage of this season to do all the detailed pricing, implementation schedule, everything else, and then that we would begin implementation, at the end of the season, so in other words, we wouldn't be putting anything in this year in our parks, but that we would design everything, price everything, but we would include that in the budget this year. So design this year, installation next year. And we probably would prefer to do it, I think, together rather than piecemeal over a couple of years. Staffing and contractors availability. I mean, part of the challenge is that we're not the only city who's looking at doing this, and so we just don't know what availability for all of the parts we would need are going to be, all the components. But that'd be our recommendation. Study and design this year, implement next year.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else you need direction on before we move on?
We're good, yeah?
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll now turn the time over to Mr. Astorga.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I've been asked to provide an assessment of the Flip the Strip program by Weber Basin Water Conservancy District. They currently offer a rebate to qualifying cities within their service area. We have been in direct communication with them, both over the phone and in person, and Bountiful City does qualify to participate in the program, subject to us amending our code. The rebate is $1.25 per square foot of turf removed and replaced with water-wise landscaping. That sentence that I wrote in the report on page 11, I took it directly from their program. No one would be able to qualify for the Flip the Strip if they simply place concrete on their park strip. That was confirmed over the phone, and in their sample contract available on their website, they indicate that concrete or other impermeable treatments do not qualify for the program. So I just want to be very clear for that. The program is summarized by them on page 26 in your packets. And on page 29, also within your packet, you'll find the attachment identified as the Waterwise Program or Ordinance Summary. This was drafted by Weber Basin. So to show you, any questions about the program itself?
I have one. So some of the literature that we've seen is no new landscapes. And if the requirement is you tear it out and you have to place something in it, put something back, how are they managing that potential conflict, do you know?
It depends on how you define landscape. Obviously, the program is for, as they indicated, for water-wise landscaping. So as far as what type of live vegetation needs to be placed within that Park Strip, they're leaving that completely up to the local jurisdictions. The current trend is about 50%.
Weber Basin walked back its initial idea of not allowing landscaping to be put in. They are now saying that's okay. It just has to meet the watering restrictions.
I'm sorry, and I guess I didn't understand the question. Thanks for clarifying it. So in looking at our current landscaping ordinance, Bountiful City, we do not require any amount of turf. We don't have a minimum and we do not have a maximum. The entire site of any given property can be xeriscape. And I have that definition, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Bountiful City does have a landscaping requirement or a percentage based on the size of each lot. So the downtown and the hospital zone, we have a 10% minimum. The commercial zones and the professional office, we have a 15% minimum. And then all things residential, the RM 7, 13, 19, and 25, as well as the single family, R1, R3, R4, and the residential foothill, we have a minimum landscaping provision of 40%. The mixed-use zone does not have a landscaping requirement, but rather of an open space. And something that I did leave out of the staff report, I have a third commercial category, the CN, which only exists in paper. It does not physically exist out there. That requirement is 25%. So that's essentially, and I have one more slide regarding this. Again, I want to reiterate, we do not require any amount of turf or lawn, neither in the private property or in the Park Strip public area. Xeriscape is defined in the code as a type of landscaping that employs a mix of drought-tolerant plants and organic materials. As part of that same definition, it also says that asphalt, concrete, brick paving, and other impervious surfaces are not considered xeriscape. So, moving on to what we would need to, in order for us to be included in the program, what we would need to change to our land use code. The first one is that in single-family residential developments, there is currently a limitation of 35% of turf area within the landscape area. That 35% is not of the lot area. That 35% would be of that 40% that is being required to be landscaped. The reason I put an asterisk here is that I got off the phone with Weber Basin on some other components of this afternoon, and they're indicating that they're considering changing this 35% limitation. They're in discussions with the state. The state is thinking about rolling out a similar program, and they want to be consistent. So this 35% might change in the near future. They told me, I spoke with them on the phone today. They told me they would know for sure in about 2 weeks. The next component is a non-single family residential. That's all things commercial, office, multifamily residential. The maximum turf area requirement would be 15%. Then we have park strip limitations. No turf in park strips, slopes greater than 25%, and areas less than 8%. They have some language regarding prohibition of turf and parking and landscape and buffer areas that would apply to commercial developments and offices. They also have irrigation control requirements. And if we move forward on this, we would need to amend our xeriscape policy, which currently only applies to park strips. So in order for Bountiful residents to be able, in order for the city, I should say, to qualify in the program, we have to amend our code regulating private development. And this only applies for future development, new single-family dwellings, new commercial, all things remodel, all things addition would be subject to these regulations. Furthermore, say if any one of you or anyone here has a site with a lot more of the, say either the 35%, that's not going to apply to you. You would still be eligible for the rebate, as they would treat that component more of a legal nonconforming status. As long as the city, we have these regulations moving forward, they would add Bountiful City to the list of participating cities. Any questions on this? And then on my last slide, does the council desire to look at changes to the land use code to be able to participate in the program? I'll be more than happy to go back.
before we maybe start that conversation, if you want to have that conversation, Lloyd has an example of what it would cost a resident to participate and how much, the savings there would be.
Did you want to go over that one?
Sure.
It's also found on
See
page
if it'll come up
13.
here.
You got it.
Here we go. So this is just a simple example that we've put together, and we try to identify a range of properties that this would apply to. So for a typical property in Bountiful, the conversion from turf to drought-tolerant plantings in the park strip is going to cost you roughly $7 to $8 a square foot. And that includes demolition, new irrigation, and new plantings. The plantings are not an insignificant cost in this itself. Now, we picked a fairly aggressive density of planting. We require 50% coverage in the park strip, so that represents a significant portion of those costs. Your rebate at $1.25 a square foot, and depending on your definition of drought tolerant or the type of plant that you choose to plant, there's a little bit of savings annually per square foot. You can see that ranges between 6 and 11 gallons per square foot. Now that is in comparison to what sod would require, and we base that on 1 inch a week per square foot. So to translate into a real world property, I picked the average R3 property that has 80 feet of frontage, has a double car wide drive approach, 6 foot wide park strip, so we're talking 360 feet. Your conversion price, about $2,945, that's $8.18 a square foot. That's pretty close to the upper end of the range that we were in. You're gonna get a rebate of $450. It's gonna cost you about $2,500 to flip your strip.
Thanks for that analysis. I called Chad Wilkinson earlier today in Layton, and you guys, many of you know him. He used to be here in Bountiful, but I asked him about this, and I have some questions about whether or not, I may have misunderstood him, but I thought that he said that they actually don't prohibit turf in the park strips, and they still participate in the program. So I don't know, I just have a little more investigating to do, but he's a good resource because we know him, and Layton City, where he now works, participates in this. But speaking for myself, I think that I'd like to consider the option of changing our ordinance, but I don't know that we're ready to, I think we need more information, but how does the council feel?
I guess my opinion would be, because this is completely optional for the residents, at their election, if they want to hire a company to do this, or if they want to put in their own sweat equity and see if they can reduce the cost to do this, I'm comfortable changing and moving this direction because it would be optional. If your landscaping is already in and you don't want to do it, you don't have to. But if you'd like to do it, having our residents be able to avail themselves of the different training classes that tie in directly to the rebate, so that residents will hopefully do it in a way that still gives us trees to help with shading of asphalt, and greenery to help cool surfaces. It seems to me that making the modifications, which to me seem fairly minor and again optional for those existing properties, doesn't give me any heartburn.
I'm happy to amend the ordinance as well, but I'm also a little bit concerned. We're getting a little bit pressed for time, and we still have 3 other agenda items for this session, and I know that there are quite a few people who are here for those. for those topics. But I don't want to cut anyone short if they have a strong opinion one way or the other.
I'm okay amending the ordinance as well, just purely for water savings, good practice, as well as flip your strip, but I think that's secondary.
So I think, do you feel like you have the direction you need? Anyone else want to comment? Richard, Cecily?
I just wanted to also second that. I'm in favor of the modification of the ordinance, and I think that it's moving the city in the right direction and giving our homeowners more options and to participate in this program. I just also did want to ask Francisco, could you clarify, you did, and maybe this was in the presentation, but you did say it would require modification to the Xeriscape land
Yes.
ordinance?
Yeah,
Did you
it's-
say exactly what that would look like?
Yeah, it's minor changes in case, in terms of the shrubs on that park strip would we would need to add a height restriction. We currently don't have that in our code. We were basing requires 24 inches, 2 feet maximum as far as height, and some other components that we just need to look at.
Would it affect the percentage of vegetation in the
No,
park strip?
No,
So
the
50%?
district is leaving that completely up to us.
And what about trees in the park strip?
They haven't indicated anything on that. We don't have a real concern with, let me rephrase that. We don't have a real concern with trees in the park strip, other than if you get the wrong tree, you might affect the sidewalk and whatnot. But there are ways to mitigate that by getting the right tree.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. I think we can get into the details of this later for the sake of time, but did you have anything you'd like to?
I wanted to ask Francisco if there was anything that, in the changes, that concerned him.
My only concern is this would be added responsibility for enforcement, completely knowing that this is affecting new construction and remodels. We have never done this before. We have never looked at a maximum lawn or turf component in the code, and we could try to manage it as we see fit. We're complaint-based, so we don't see major issues, but this is something that we have never done.
So I would just say that I don't have a problem changing it, as long as our staff is okay with changing it. People can Xeriscape right now if they want to. We don't have restrictions on that.
We do
So,
not, and
If you want to do it, go for it. Go crazy.
And by the way, the Park Strip Xeriscaping ordinance was adopted in 2007. So people have the option to do that since 2007.
I think that the Flip Your Strip is a clever name that will benefit very, very few people. But if it gets people talking about it, great.
Yeah, I think I just might add, because we've talked about this quite a bit internally, this does not provide additional options for our resident. It reduces options for our residents on what they can landscape in their yards. If that reduction is worth the savings or the small amount of people that will actually flip their strip, then that's fine if that's the policy. But this we should be clear, this reduces options for residents and what they can plant.
And if you're willing to come back to the council so that we can further clarify that and look at possible ordinance, I think that's the direction. Does that sound right, council, everyone?
Absolutely, and one more quick thing. I would rather do that once the state decides what they want to do, so we don't have to amend it twice.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, well, we will move to the next item on our agenda, which is short-term rental discussion. Mr. Astorga.
Back to me. All right. Short-term rentals. Let's go back in time. We had a work session discussion last month regarding short-term rentals. And outlined here in front of you, which is also on page 31 on your staff report, is the direction that was provided, is highlighted, oh, it's not highlighted, it's in bold, where we discussed these 6 components that night, and there was a majority from council that agreed on these components, and then the black ones were the ones in bold, I'm sorry, were the ones that we needed additional information to be brought before you here. And what we have is, we have a reduced fee if you're having a combination short-term rental within an ADU. We also added an enforcement component, and we also, we would be ready, if you want to move forward on this, to prepare a TRT, transient room tax, that would be enacted. The recommendation was already provided from the Planning Commission for the noticing of of each application. As a reminder, this would be an application that would be delegated as a land use authority to the administrative committee. Originally, as staff, we thought 100 feet was a good idea. Planning Commission said 300 feet would be better, and most of you agreed on that. So we, during that work session discussion, council requested that we have another work session, that's today, to take a look at it, and if we're ready, we could come back with a public hearing at City Council as early as the 26th. I think that's the next meeting to take care of this. So we added item G. Now I'm looking at page 36 of your packets, where we have the enforcement component, and also item H is where we have the added fee. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. Not much change from the original recommendation that came from the Planning Commission. But I do want to say that we didn't want to get into creating a rigorous or a table of if this, then that regarding enforcement, as I don't have that component in any of my land use regulations. Each code enforcement case is treated one at a time based on its offense, based on the validity of each complaint. And some components are initiated by staff, the ones that are involved with the immediate threat of health, safety, and welfare. But on an average, we are 97-98% complaint-based on that. So it would simply, item H regarding code enforcement, it would allow the planning director to take appropriate action, working closely with the city attorney, and if necessary, the city prosecutor to revoke the business license and even revoke the permit. We all heard in the news last week, the worst case scenario took place in a short-term rental. I'm not saying that this is going to be repeated, but we do want to have the ability to say, you know what, we're done. We're simply going to revoke the permit. But also, we want to investigate each complaint hand in hand with whatever might happen at night with our police department, and take each complaint seriously. We take each complaint one at a time, and we simply go from there. That's all I have, since we spent a significant amount of time at that last meeting. Again, not much change other than item G and H outlined on page 36 of the drafted ordinance.
Thank you.
I'll be more happy to answer any other questions.
What questions do you have, council?
I have a question with item G. On line 81, any complaint properly received by the city shall be reasonably investigated. What qualifies as properly
In writing.
received? In writing?
In writing.
So could we maybe, instead of, since properly is kind of vague, could we say any complaint received in writing? Just to be more specific, so people who are wanting to make complaints or feel that they have grievances that need to be addressed, they know the steps that need to be taken.
Any other questions?
I'd like to make or propose an addition to the proposed ordinance components. There have been a lot of people who have reached out on both sides of this issue, and they're all, the concerns are valid on all sides of this issue. I think each of us have done a great deal of research and listening and looking into this. One thing that often comes up as a concern is the fact that a lot of people are worried that some of the whole home rentals, which are considered in the ordinance, would not be owner occupied. We kind of have two different categories that are proposed. One would be a whole home rental. That could be an investor or somebody who owns it but lives out of state, or the ADU model. And I think it bears, or it warrants looking at this in a purposeful, thoughtful way, and maybe viewing them a little bit differently. And even considering how we treat them as a city maybe a little bit differently. In the model of an ADU, you have an owner occupant. They are there. They are an accountable party. However, if something is a whole home and it's an investment property, you might not have that. And I would propose that we consider something along the lines of having a registered agent or responsible party that is registered along with that short-term rental at the time of getting the permit for the short-term rental, and that there would be a named and local party who has the ability and locally to address problems, that they live either within the boundaries of Bountiful or within a certain distance, maybe 20 miles or 20 minutes, to be able to get to the property, and that they would be available and to deal with any problems arising from the short-term rental property. Again, I don't think that would be necessary or appropriate for the ADU model, but I think that that would be appropriate for the whole home rental. And kind of additionally on that front, I think it's also worth considering that we look at how many short-term rentals could be owned by an individual investor or owner. So we don't get holding companies or other organizations coming in and buying, or investors buying up a lot of properties that could ultimately affect our housing stock. So that's something that I think could provide a common sense and balanced solution for people who are worried about their neighborhoods being affected by short-term rentals, especially in the case where it's the whole home being rented.
I was just going to say, if my memory serves me correctly, I think Provo did something along these lines about 20 years ago when student housing was getting out of control with private investors, and residents didn't have an ability to complain to anybody because it was just someone somewhere who owned the home when things weren't taken care of. So I appreciate that idea by Councilwoman Price Hewish.
Any other thoughts?
I like this idea too. I think it should apply to only standalone short-term rentals. I think ADUs are the helpful model where there already exists an on-site owner to hopefully, be that quick contact for any problem issues. So I would be interested in seeing that in a future draft, that a standalone short-term rental be required to list a registered agent. If that's the appropriate term, maybe there's a different term. Registered agent does make me think like a realtor.
Responsible party.
Local contact.
Local contact, responsible party that is going to, live within a reasonably responsive geographic area, perhaps the same geographic area we use for our employees that are with the police department or the power department that are within a certain response radius. And that be something they have to update every time they renew their business license as well, so that information stays fresh and current.
So could I ask a follow-up on that? If we have that registered agent, are you saying that they have to live within this boundary or work within that boundary? And what happens when he or she relocates, their office changes or they move? And these are the challenges that I have based on the annual, I guess we could cover this in the annual business license review, but then it gets a little bit trickier to try to enforce. Oh, your guy moved, I have to revoke your permit.
Well, I think that you bring up a really good solution, that it could be just specific language in the renewal of the business license for a short-term rental property. And there could just be a simple question, is there any change in the responsible party? And what is the new responsible party's name, address, et cetera?
I don't think there would be any obligation on your department's part to track those in real time. That would be information provided when they apply for their license. If I'm not speaking out of turn.
I don't see a downside of asking for that information and providing some local connectivity to preserve that property in the proper neighborhood feel. Whether it's, we've been concerned about taking the trash cans in and maintaining the yard, and I think having that local connectivity provides some value and assurance in that regard.
Unfortunately, we're short on time. What other questions or guidance do you have about this ordinance?
All right, I have one more. So I think this is something that, since it's going to be a new ordinance dealing with something that is so important to people, their private property rights, their ability to, why they moved to Bountiful, their, idea of the values and the, what we prioritize as a city, is all so closely wrapped up and tied into our property and our streets and our neighborhoods. And so I would love to see, and I think it would provide us a good opportunity to have, reflection on this, is an annual review where we can let people know we're going to review this, we're going to take a look, and we're going to see, are there unintended consequences? How is it affecting our housing stock? And maybe that's just a quick, things are looking good, but I think that would provide homeowners and people who are STR permit holders, as well as renters, as well as the city, a good opportunity to just take a look at, without it, being a surprise or having to create a whole new momentum or mechanism to do that. So I think having that built in, an annual review, would provide a good mechanism to look at this and see, is it accomplishing the goals we want in the way we want? Are there negative impacts, et cetera?
All right, was that clear? Do you feel like an annual review in terms of what as a council, what we want to do in this ordinance?
I think that I would have all the data in front of me as we move forward to have, we're talking about an annual review of the program. It all depends on what resources we have and what our priorities are regarding for that specific year. This would be an added assessment that I have to bring forward. So if we want to do it on an annual basis, or perhaps we could have the director say, we have a problem, let's bring it up.
Francisco, does the council now have to adopt moderate income housing report every year?
Yes, we do that prior to, I think it's November 1st.
So perhaps we can just wrap it into that. I wouldn't put it in the ordinance that we have an annual review. I think we have sufficient direction that we just include that as part of our annual moderate income housing report to the council, kind of an update on.
Yeah, that sounds good.
STRs.
The combination of those things.
That's how I would prefer
Okay.
to.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you feel like you have direction for moving ahead on this?
I do. With that said, would you like us to move forward and simply prepare an ordinance for the 26th and tee it up for a public hearing?
With the inclusion of the
Right.
registered agent idea, I'm comfortable with that.
Okay.
As well as the change to that language
The
Writing.
in writing.
in writing.
Everyone comfortable with that?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. We will table the next item, number 3 on our work session agenda. We will talk about that at a future time. And is it okay if we move the newsletter item to the next, to our meeting,
That's-
upcoming meeting?
Yep, if that's okay.
Okay.
That'll take 3 minutes, probably.
I just want to ask the public, was there anyone here that was here for the prioritized project update? Okay. All right. We will take a quick break and come back for our regular meeting.